had a vision. It was time. And he began to travel, picking up disciples along the way, because these disciples would carry his ideas forward when he was gone. The land he was traveling was very divided. There were the very, very rich, who were few in number. The rich, who were slightly more numerous. And then you had mostly everyone else. People living just a little better than hand to mouth, because the taxes required to keep the very, very rich happy were steep. And then you had a few who had nothing. They were outcasts, thrown away from society because they had a handicap or an illness that made them unclean, because God, it seemed, had turned God's back on them. And so in his travels, the man began to reach out and teach what he said God wanted out of life. And the first thing he did was heal. He had great power, and he went and he touched and healed all those he met in society who had been outcast because of illness or a handicap. He knocked down the notion that somehow these people had committed some great sin that God was punishing them for, and instead restored them to family and their friends. He broke all the rules as he did this. He touched these people. He spoke to them. You weren't supposed to do those things. These people were unclean, but he did it anyway. And as he did it, he let all those around him know that God was not against sick people. God was for people in need. The world he was traveling in wasn't just divided economically. Even among the poor, there was division. Peasant farmers, craftspeople, and fishermen. They didn't all mix. And that probably made the very rich quite happy, because, when the people were squabbling among themselves, any chance of real revolt or cry for change, pretty minimal. And so the man began in a very real way and political way to address these differences. And he did it with, of all things, food. You see, in this world, you were who you ate with. You didn't eat above or below folks in your social class. You didn't want to. And as people flocked to hear the man teach, and as they came to him to be healed or to watch him heal, he began in a very kind of sneaky fashion to turn this whole thing around. To the point where there was a feeding of 5,000 people of all walks of life, where these people sat down together and broke bread and passed it and gave each other fish, doing the whole thing probably dumbfounded because, well, they were breaking a cardinal rule of their society. They were breaking the rules because it seemed God had other ideas. And even more amazing, this man would enter the homes of tax collectors and sinners, go into the living places of these despised people because he wanted to share his vision even with them. And through all of this, the man taught a wisdom that seemed, well, kind of backwards when you heard it. Lose your life, and you'll find it. The least of all will be first. When you've done it for the least of all, you've done it for me. Who was this man's neighbor? It was hardly a wisdom designed to get ahead in life. It was a wisdom that said instead, if you want life, pour out your life for others. And finally, the man became an instigator. Yep, he started a movement. And anywhere he went proclaiming, the kingdom of God has come near you. The kingdom of God is among you. And it was absurd. It was absurd because the people he was talking to, most of them were struggling and desperate. And for him to say that God was with them, but slowly they began to see it in this man. And as they started to pour out their lives for one another and for others, they began to feel it. And as they took to heart his words and tried to live them out, they saw indeed the kingdom was present. Social barriers crumbled. Religious barriers fell away. Ignorance and fear were replaced by God's love, as God's love was demonstrated in healing, in teaching, and in the breaking of bread. Then the dream came to an end, or so it seemed. A Roman cross ruined everything, except it didn't. And in this chapter of Matthew, Jesus stands before them again after that crucifixion. And he says simple words. He says, "Go into all the world, teach everything I've taught you, baptize, and remember I am with you to the end of the age." Of course, this has all been about Jesus. But even as so many in this world proclaim Christ, too many have forgotten who he is. When I was a child, this text was read to me with a very specific purpose. It was read so that I would go out and, frankly, collect souls. I was asked every Sunday in Sunday school at my very conservative church, "Did you go out and tell people about Jesus this week?" And the emphasis here, of course, was very well intentioned, but it was completely spiritualized. The idea was to get the folks we met to talk about Jesus just like we talked about Jesus, to believe just like we believe, so that when they died, they wouldn't go to hell. And if they said the right words, that was it, and we just went on with life as usual. Now, I'm all for believing in Jesus. I've sort of dedicated my life to this. Okay? But what was odd about this was all the what for attached to believing in Jesus. Well, all the reasons for believing, except for escaping the fires of hell, they weren't there. And because we didn't really understand Jesus, sharing Jesus felt hollow sometimes. And eventually, even though I knew God's love, even though I knew Jesus, I realized I didn't understand him. And I really had to come home in college, because I was talking to a Jewish friend, and he didn't believe in hell. As we've talked about, hell is not an Old Testament Jewish concept. And he just couldn't see what good this Jesus I was talking about could be. And I realized because he didn't believe in hell, I didn't have an answer. So why go over who this Jesus is? Why talk about it today? Because when Jesus sends us out into the world, Jesus is saying, teach all that I've taught and do all that I have done. Not just worry about whether or not everybody's on the same team. Because the incredible, great, radical part of the Jesus message is that God's love is for all. No matter what team they're on. God's love would cure the Roman centurion's daughter. God's love would make clean that Greek fellow who was filled with demons. God's love would allow Jesus to speak to an unclean Samaritan woman. God's love would create a table where all people could be welcome and break bread together and share drink together and share the good things of life despite their social standing or their race. I go over this because this is a Jesus worth sharing. This is a Jesus worth proclaiming. This is a Jesus worth pouring your life out for. A radical who lived radically to proclaim God's reign of love. And there's nothing hollow and nothing empty in this example and message. And my dream and my hope is that we will now join him. That we will be instigators. Instigators of love, of peace, of joy, of hope. Instigators of God's holy kingdom.